Hey everyone, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and what I want to do in this video is address the question that's asked, or maybe respond to the statement when people claim there is no evidence for God. What I want to do is give a response. So what's the deal here? I mean, I hear this all the time, even in the comments of some of my own videos, and I don't claim this is going to put this issue to rest entirely, in part because pretty much no one's heard of my channel, but at least I will have given a response, so I will feel better about myself for having given this response, right? So let's define a few terms here. We need to know what evidence is and what God is. So what we mean by God, let's just take the traditional Judeo-Christian God. So we're not playing these games of, oh, God could be defined as anything, and then you can kind of get out of that way. I think that's that's kind of like cheating. So let's just take an all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God, like in the Judeo-Christian God. And let's look at evidence. This is where it gets to be a little bit interesting. We need to look at what the definition of evidence is. What do we mean, right? So Merriam-Webster defines evidence in a couple different ways. Talks about an outward sign, something that furnishes or who furnishes proof or testimony, or something or someone that bears witness. So they're kind of these different definitions for what it means. I don't really like the word proof. Part of the reason is in my field, in mathematics and engineering, when we say proof, we actually mean something pretty analytic. We mean something that you don't really get in science. So I try to avoid using the word proof as opposed to just evidence. In that sense, if we require proof as evidence, then we can say we can't prove the world isn't an illusion or a dream. We can't prove that we're not living in the matrix, but perhaps we could still argue that we have evidence that we're not, or maybe not. I don't know. So I want to offer 5 things that typically count as evidence, and this is no way an exhaustive list, but it's at least getting you in the right headspace. The first thing is mathematical or logical proofs, and this is what we actually mean by proof, things that are proven using the tools of logic. Then we have scientific experiments. We have logical or rational arguments, so these aren't necessarily proofs in the traditional sense, but they are arguments for a position, and you could argue this counts as evidence. If I offer a good explanation, this is an evidence for that claim being true. You have personal experience, and then you also have the testimony of others. And some of this evidence also would count maybe in a legal sense too, right? When you say, okay, well, what evidence does the prosecution have that this person is guilty of a crime? Maybe they will bring someone to the stand who was a witness or somebody who saw the crime for themselves, these sorts of things. And because there are examples of each of these that are used to argue God's existence, I think what we really have to say is for the person who's claiming there's no evidence of God's existence, they basically are either lying, ignorant, or they think all such arguments fail. And if there's another fourth option, perhaps you could add that to the list and we would consider it with these other ones. So even though I'm inclined to think that the first two play quite a bit of a role in a lot of people's thinking, let's just put those aside and look at the claim that all such arguments fail, right? Because if the person who's claiming there's no evidence for God is lying or ignorant, then we can just dismiss their claim. But if their claim is there's no evidence for God, really what they're claiming is that all arguments for God fail. And not only do they all fail so miserably that none of them give any evidence to the proposition God exists. So none of them provide a single amount of, or a single shred of evidential support to the proposition God exists. And that's different than just claiming, oh, I find these arguments unconvincing, or I'm personally not convinced. You're actually claiming, when you say there's no evidence, there exists no evidence, that every single argument fails so miserably that they don't work at all. And I want you to appreciate how strong of a claim this is, because this is a very strong claim, and one that we need to make sure there's evidence for that claim, because that claim is a claim in and of itself that needs to be supported. So the thing I want to say is to the theist who hears this claim, all evidence for God fail, I would say definitely push back on this claim. Do not let the atheist who makes this claim weasel out of the burden of proof for such an incredible statement. Because if there's any such argument that could provide a single amount of evidence for the existence of God, then the entire claim, all evidence for God fail, or there's no evidence for God's existence, just completely goes down the toilet, basically. So this is where I would push back. It's fair for an atheist to say, I am unconvinced by the evidence for God. That's something that can be argued and reasoned about. But claiming there is no evidence or all arguments fail, that's an incredible claim. And that is one that certainly... I mean, I'm not convinced by that. So, the atheist who would claim that to me would need to provide evidence of that claim. And I would say too, if you're a theist and somebody asks you this question, it is not your job to provide evidence that don't fail. It is the person making this claim who is claiming that every single argument fails. So you don't need to come up with answers. They can come up with answers for arguments and certain arguments and why they fail. But you can basically say, well, here are some more arguments, right? They're only justified in continuing to claim that all evidence for God fail if they can show why each of these arguments fail. And once again, they have to fail miserably enough to not provide any evidential support. So right, what's the claim here? If I'm claiming all evidence for God fails, I'm claiming that I have familiarity with every single argument for God's existence. And as a result, if somebody is going to claim to me all evidence for God fails, I'm going to say, okay, then this means you've investigated all of them, right? And if I ask you why any of them fail, you should be able to provide a good reason why each one fails. And this is just crazy. You could pick half a dozen examples, and I've never seen somebody able to do this. And I understand, right? Maybe I'm putting them on the spot, right? But Alvin Plantinga, he has this paper, just a short paper, it has over 24 theistic arguments, right? If an atheist came to me and claimed there's no evidence for God's existence, I would be like, all right, here's Plantinga's paper, pick 6 of these arguments and show why, just a quarter of them. Pick 6 of them and show me why they each fail, and I'll believe you in this particular way. So they can go off and do it, and maybe I'd be satisfied. But the fact that no one is even, people, in a lot of cases, people maybe aren't even familiar with this, but the fact that people haven't done this, it's just, have you even engaged with the arguments? And are you even justified saying that all arguments fail and will fail? That's its own thing. Once again, it's not that these arguments are necessarily, if you can show that they're not completely conclusive, that would still provide evidence, even if it's like, well, there are other things you could, conclude from this. It's not about that. It's that if the evidence fails, if there's really no evidence, that means every single argument has to fail so poorly that it doesn't provide any support to the proposition. I think that's the key piece here. And that's where I would just push back on this claim, right? The fact that a lot of these arguments are in serious debate in philosophical journals, and they have been for many years, it's, in my opinion, reasons to at least think that these arguments fail. If they all failed, then people wouldn't be continually debating them. And it's not enough to just assert that they fail. You have to actually show why they fail. And I'll say, there are definitely arguments that have failed, just in the same way that there are many naturalistic explanations for things that have also failed. But the claim here is not that some fail, it's that all have failed or all have and will fail. And this, once again, implies a familiarity with all such arguments, not just a few of them, not just the poor ones that people give when they haven't really thought about these things, but every single argument, including the ones argued in these philosophical journals and things. I'd still say the fact that they're still being debated and argued seems to imply that they have anything but failed. In fact, they're succeeding at continuing to create discussion, which I think is a very good thing. And I would say too, most of the sophisticated atheists that I know who've at least engaged with some of these arguments, they're instead going to say that they're unconvincing, not a failure. They know better than to claim that they're a failure because, once again, you have to show why it's a failure, and you also have to continue addressing any points that could claim, well, it could be successful under this circumstance or that circumstance. You would once again have to show that all of those premises fail, everything fails. It's just a really strong claim. So I think a better place, if you're an atheist, is just say, I find all evidence or all arguments that I've seen thus far unconvincing. And then at that point, you can actually have a productive discussion. You can say, okay, well, what do you find unconvincing about this? Would there be something that would change your mind? Blah, blah, blah. But to claim that there is no evidence or that all the arguments fail, I think it's just way too strong of a claim. And why I think many theists are going to assume that this just means somebody's being ignorant or somebody's just lying. The next thing I want to do is look at this claim a little bit more closely. I want to continue specifically look at number 2, what counts as evidence, because I think this happens in many cases too. When somebody claims that there's no evidence for God's existence, in many cases, I think what they're implicitly saying is there's no scientific evidence or natural evidence that convinces me of God's existence. And as a result, when people say, prove to me that God exists, they don't really want a logical proof based on contingency or causality or anything like that. Maybe they won't accept those things. They're really saying, well, design a scientific experiment that will demonstrate God exists, similar to how we demonstrate the existence of natural things. But this is kind of a category error, because this is basically God doesn't exist in the natural order. So why would there be some sort of natural experiment that could be made to test God exists? So category error, if you're not familiar with it, is basically trying to ask a question where the answer to the question doesn't belong to the same category as the thing in question. So when I ask, what color is 2 plus 2? It's like 2 plus 2 gives me a number. It doesn't give me a color. So the question is invalid. And in a similar way, the idea that you could do some sort of scientific experiment to demonstrate that God does or does not exist is assuming that God exists in the natural order of things, which by definition, he does not. He created the natural order and he's in many cases outside of it, right? And in many cases, I think too, this is just in a deliberate or maybe an ignorant attempt to narrowly restrict the allowed types of evidence to what we wouldn't even expect to see, even if it were true, right? Because you could just as easily say, okay, if you claim God doesn't exist, design a scientific experiment that proves God doesn't exist. And you can't do it because, there's all these other reasons. Somebody could say, okay, well, I'm going to prove that God doesn't exist because I'm going to pray for this thing and it's not going to happen. But then, of course, the theist gets to say, well, maybe God didn't want this thing to happen. So, this is something that cuts both ways here. And I think the question that you need to ask here is not, what scientific evidence would convince me that God exists, but what evidence would I expect to find if a God did exist, and how would I come to know one way or another? Now I think you're getting somewhere, and I think these are the right questions to ask, rather than claiming, being too positivist about it. Instead, just being a little bit more open-minded and say, what would I expect to find? What evidence would I not expect to find? I think atheists who argue, okay, I don't think God exists because there's so much evil in the world, I think that's a fair point to say, like, I don't think that this exists because it seems to me this, and this. That's a different type of argument. But that's different than saying, okay, prove to me scientifically which once again, scientific experiments don't even provide proof per se, but they provide evidence. So that's kind of its own thing. But even then, I hope you see that this is not the kind of evidence we're going to expect to find. And I think many people are familiar with this, right? The person who asks a question like that, demonstrate to me, scientifically, I really see this as a result of a flawed epistemology rather than it being anything insightful. In the same way, these are the people, presumably, maybe they do or don't believe in human rights, but this is pretty much like asking the question, right? Demonstrate to me human rights exist and I'll start believing in them. Or demonstrate to me that I live in the real world and not the Matrix or some computer simulation and I'll believe it. Show me some evidence of this stuff. And if these things did exist, would they be the kinds of things that we would expect to be able to be tested and found out in this particular way? And if somebody does believe they live in the real world, or they do believe in human rights, but not God, to the theist, it looks like special pleading. It looks like they're raising their evidential standard for God for some reason that's difficult to understand for whatever reason. That's why it looks like special pleading. And I hope that the atheist or agnostic who is watching this video, and if so, thank you, because I'm probably being pretty harsh. I hope you understand why it would look like special pleading to those of us who are theists. To say, okay, well, you accept these things based on evidence that presumably isn't scientifically demonstrative, but yet you deny or you aren't convinced by the existence of God. It's just interesting, right? This is once again, this is epistemology. This is a little bit different. Now I want to go through maybe one or two different rebuttals to this. One rebuttal I sometimes hear is, well, everything else has a natural explanation. Why assume we need to invoke God or propose God as a theory? And at that point, I would just say, I don't agree with that. I think that's false. Natural explanations, when people claim this, just because we can come up with a possible explanation given the constraints of naturalism, doesn't necessarily mean these explanations are plausible, likely, or even good explanations necessarily. So the fact that it's like, I can give an explanation or offer such an explanation under these conditions, that doesn't necessarily mean that such an explanation is good. It just means that you can offer one. And I mean this to say, that doesn't mean we should discount natural explanations. I think in many cases, natural explanations are some of the best ones we have for a lot of different things, but that doesn't mean that they're the only types of explanations that are good. And then other things that are just difficult to find a natural explanation for, things like the existence of reason itself, the usefulness or the existence of mathematics, the existence or epistemology of objective morality. If you believe in objective morality, whether or not this has a natural basis or natural explanation is very controversial. And I would obviously argue, no, I don't think it has a natural explanation. So that's kind of its own thing too. The other thing too is an explanation for the existence of the natural order itself. Such an explanation would have to be outside of nature for why the natural order exists. You could argue this has to be supernatural, or maybe what I would like to say is metanatural, something that's outside of the natural order that would eventually cause the natural world or account for the natural world's existence. And this is why the naturalist is constrained to claiming that some things can happen uncaused from nothing. Because if causality is something that is metanatural, then that would mean naturalism is false, because, you would argue causality or any of these other logical principles would have to exist before nature. So that's why the naturalist is basically stuck having to assume that things can just happen uncaused from nothing, and that's why the natural world exists. Their claim is actually a pretty strong claim that the natural world popped into existence from nothing and it exists for no purpose or anything like that. So the extent to which that's a good explanation is up for debate, I would say. The other rebuttal I sometimes hear is Russell's Teapot, and I don't think that this has much cognitive meaning as much as trying to be an emotional appeal, but we'll still address it, right? So people will say, well, why should I believe in God? I don't believe in invisible leprechauns or magic teapots or these other sorts of things. The example of Russell's Teapot is this invisible teapot revolving around Mars. It's like, well, I can't say that I can't prove it doesn't exist, but why would I assume that it did exist? The first thing to note is it's just a false equivalence or false comparison. Obviously, if these things existed, they would exist within the natural order. They're not created from something outside of the natural order. So it's a different thing, right? If leprechauns existed, then under the traditional idea of God, they would have been things that God created themselves. So just from contingency itself, they would be different than God. But you could also just say, yeah, well, I believe in this invisible thing called logic that can come and, help our minds create reality. Is this like leprechauns or magic teapots or these sorts of things? Just because we can't visually see something, does that mean it's like false? I think such logic of trying to imply this is just childish, honestly. I think that's what it comes down to. Yeah, and if these arguments are going to succeed, right, you actually need to show that if you're going to say, well, you don't believe in leprechauns, right? Well, is there leprechaunology? Is this a huge field of study that has a lot of published work and people who dedicate their life to studying and arguing for the existence of these things? And if not, well, that could be one reason why the existence of God is a different sort of thing than the existence of leprechauns or teapots. If billions of people claim that they had experiences with leprechauns or teapots, that would be a different thing than just, proposing some random thing exists for the sake of really trying to ridicule a certain belief. So that's why I don't find these arguments all that convincing. And there aren't, you wouldn't necessarily say that leprechauns result from the result of logical arguments in the same way that the existence of God can follow from logical arguments. So I just don't see how this is a fair comparison and has any actual evidential weight other than really trying to just make a mockery of theism. And also I'd say, it begs a question in favor of naturalism. It assumes naturalism is true and then just puts all the stuff that wouldn't be explained by naturalism in the same boat. And I hope that's easy to see, right? It's like, well, you don't believe in other things that we wouldn't expect under naturalism. So why do you believe this thing? And you could say, well, because I don't believe in naturalism. So I don't put all these things in the same category. And I reject the premise that, if I believe in God, I would have to believe in leprechauns and magic teapots and things. I think that's, once again, just presupposing that naturalism is true and all these other things are false. So anyway, thanks for watching. Hope you found this video interesting. Let me know in the comments if you think all such arguments for God fail and you've given a response to Plantinga's arguments. I'd be curious to hear what they are. Haven't looked at that paper in a while, but I'll provide a link there. Anyway, have a good one.